Chicken Yogi Show, the podcast that brings you spiritual wellness discussions from the chicken yogi, Kit Kilstow. Broadcasting from their homestead, the spiritual home of the Akiam Institute, Kit helps you find the magic within to overcome life's struggles and live your authentic life. Their focus is on what they call trauma-sensitive spiritual wellness, the ability to tap into your inner magic and access your spiritual self with supportive, nurturing care. Listen to deep dives on spiritual topics, as well as practical tips to create the magic you need to live well and live authentically in the Chicken Yogi Show. On today's show, I want to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, and that is making yoga accessible for people who are not traditionally in the yoga space. If you followed me for any length of time, you know that I am somebody who works with those who don't fit into society's boxes. I identify as neurodivergent. I am disabled due to a chronic illness as well as my neurodivergence. And I'm also non-binary trans. And so what that means is quite often many of the people in the yoga space don't really think about how to make yoga accessible for somebody like myself. And so I don't want you to experience that. I don't want you to come into a yoga space and feel as if somebody has not taken your body, your size, your neurodivergence, your identity into consideration. And so I am passionate about making yoga accessible. And so I want to focus today on a couple of things to make yoga accessible specifically for individuals who are of larger frame and larger body, as well as those who are disabled and or identify as neurodivergent, because there's some overlap within those communities, and there are also ways that making yoga more accessible for one aspect of those communities, for example, neurodivergence, actually helps everybody. And so I just wanted to dive into a couple of things that I've seen as I've taken classes with other teachers and how I try to make those issues something that people that come to my classes don't experience. Now, before I get started, one of the things I want to say and acknowledge is that there are a lot of people doing wonderful work in this space. I follow several of them on Instagram. I try to connect with them on Twitter and other social media platforms. So, first of all, I want to say I'm not the first person and I'm not the only person in this space doing this. I also want to say that I'm speaking from my own experience. If you have things which help make yoga accessible for you that I have not mentioned, I encourage you to reach out to me. I love to hear from people. I love to hear how yoga becomes more accessible for people. So don't hesitate to reach out. Like I said, I love to hear from you. So I want to begin by talking about something that seems obvious and yet is not obvious to yoga teachers. And that is those of us who are either not as flexible as we might well be, or who are not as flexible as those you see on Instagram or on social media doing yoga, and those who are of larger body, who are plus size. And what I mean by that is I recently took a plus size yoga teacher training. And as a plus size person, I am fluffy. No shame in that, and I don't acknowledge to hide that at all. But as somebody who is of larger body and who wants to work with people with larger bodies, I took a plus size yoga teaching class. And what I quickly discovered was that the person teaching the class had absolutely no concept of what it was like to live and exist in a larger body. There are some adaptations, not just using props like straps or blocks or bolsters. There's a lot of things that you can do just to make yoga more comfortable on your body. But for those of us who are larger size, for example, we have thicker thighs, our bellies are bigger. And so when you do things like forward bending, a lot of times it's important to make room for your belly. or to actually lift your belly up and then bend forward to get a deep stretch. Now, you don't have to do that, and I encourage you to only flex or bend or go into a pose to the point where it's comfortable for you. But there are poses like child's pose is a very important one, where if you have bigger thighs and you have a larger belly, when you fold down into child's pose, which to describe, you go on your knees and then you try to sit on your heels and stretch your arms out in front of you. Well, many of our larger bodied friends and myself can't sit on our heels, and that's because of the size of our thighs as well as our belly. And so if you offer simple modifications, like instead of putting your knees together or your thighs together when you sit down to bend forward, go ahead and spread them a little bit to leave some space between them for your belly. When you're going into a wide-legged stance to do a forward bend, go ahead and leave some room for your stomach, so as you bend forward, your stomach has some place to go. It's a simple modification like that that a lot of yoga teachers don't really think about providing. And so because of that, a lot of plus size people within the yoga space are left feeling like they can't do it or it's not built for them. And this is reinforced, sadly, by the images on social media of some person who is in a very advanced yoga pose, often a handstand or crow or a balancing pose, that takes a lot of time and work to get into. And it's something that, that's what people think of yoga. And so that's why it's a cliche, certainly, and almost a very bad joke, where it's, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said, have you tried yoga, you would be so rich you wouldn't worry about your chronic illness or your disability. And the reason for that is because when people think of yoga, that's what people think about. However, yoga can be as simple as watching your breath, yogic breathing. Yoga can be working with different poses, and there are several poses. For example, corpse pose, where you lay down and you just let your arms and legs relax. That's a pose that a large majority of people who would identify as disabled would be able to do, but that's also not what comes to mind when you think of yoga. And so when you think about those poses, going back to that plus size teacher training, one of the things I noticed was that the poses that were being done were, first of all, given without any adaptations for those of us with larger bodies. It's, the person doing the class was a very advanced yoga practitioner, had a great deal of flexibility. And so it didn't cross their mind. And, I was kind of disgusted taking the class because it didn't provide any of the subtle ways to adjust the poses. It didn't talk about any of the challenges faced by plus size people. And those are things that we need to talk about and we need to have discussions about in order to create a more inclusive yoga space. So because of that, I was going through the poses and watching this class, and basically it was just a series of several different hour-long yoga classes. And so something you need to think about is if you're working with a population of people who maybe have not done a lot of fitness work, their body is not able to do a lot of fitness work, starting an hour-long class might be too much, to be honest. There are days, depending on, how you feel, that, 15 minutes might be too much. And so we need to think about how long our yoga classes are. Obviously, if you can get into a flow and, you are able to go through a longer class, then that has some benefits, but it's also important to start where you are. And again, if you can do one pose for a couple of minutes, there's no shame in that. There's no shame in doing a quick 10 to 15 minute flow, maybe a sun salutation followed by a few more poses, or just followed by corpse pose and some relaxation and meditation. Because again, yoga is not about twisting yourself into a pretzel. It's about knowing your body and knowing yourself through your body. So Along those lines, as a neurodivergent person and somebody who has not been very athletic, one of the things that I've noticed, even in classes that are geared towards slower yoga, not so much like hot fit yoga, but yoga designed to be easier or for relaxing purposes, is that a lot of times the cues are given in disordered fashion. What I mean by that is instead of laying out all of the steps we're going to do, and it's, for example, lift your left arm over your head, and as you do that, stretch out your right foot and, hold it in front of you. So you get that sort of cueing, and I apologize, I just pulled that off the top of my head. But then it's like, and then you do this and this and this. And a lot of times, an instructor who has done yoga for a long time will be like, okay, we're moving from this pose to this pose to this pose to this pose to this pose. And they're moving so quickly through the poses that you don't get a chance to actually see and figure out what's going on, but they also don't explain what they are. And as somebody who might not be familiar with yoga, who might not be familiar with the pose names, especially if they're giving the pose names in Sanskrit, which I am all for. I believe we should go back to the source and give honor to where yoga came from and use the Sanskrit pose names or asana names where possible. But also, somebody who's not familiar with yoga may not know those. And even if we're calling them things like downward dog, cobra, upward dog, lotus pose, you may not know what those are unless they are actually explained to you. Okay, this is what we're doing. And so people who give instructions in a very rapid fire pace, that may be okay for somebody who's experienced or for who's looking for a more fitness type experience. But if you're neurodivergent, which a lot of times with autism, it comes with an issue with perioperception, which is actually knowing where the parts of your body are at any given time. A lot of time, those of us who are neurodivergent may stumble a lot. We may bump into walls, and it's just because in our brains, it's very hard for us to actually constantly be thinking about where every part of our body is. So if somebody says, like, lift your right foot, well, first it's like, okay, which right? Which foot's your right foot? And then, okay, where is it now? We need to lift it. How high do we lift it? Do we straighten our knee? There's so many things that go on when you think about that, that people who are not precise with their descriptions and who are not precise with their guidelines and what should be happening with each pose, that is quite possibly going to cause confusion and may cause somebody to give up on your class. I've taken a couple of classes where everything was so rapid fire that I was, 3 minutes in, I was like, oh no, whoa, wait a minute. This obviously is not for me. And recognizing that something isn't for you is a act of self-love. And it is totally okay to say, this is not my style. This person clearly does not understand how my body works and is not able to communicate this for me, and then move on to somebody who can. And finally, I just kind of want to talk about the inclusiveness of language. A lot of times in yoga or in spiritual type spaces, we get hung up a lot on language. We talk in very flowery terms, especially in female presenting or female oriented spaces. There's a lot of talk about sisters, or the sisterhood or divine goddess. And when you think about that, that can be off-putting to people in your spaces who do not identify as a woman, as a sister, as a goddess. And when you think about what words you're using, even if somebody presents as female and thinks, okay, this might be beneficial to me because I'm female presenting, even if I identify as non-binary, or I can pass as female even though I'm transmasculine. When you think about that, then you're excluding people from your spaces and you're making it very uncomfortable for them. There's also a lot of use of, hello, you beautiful people, hello, you lovely people. And it's a habit I've been trying to get myself out of, is thinking about gender neutral ways of talking to people, but also doing it without attaching qualities to them that they may not see in themselves and that they may not wish to embody. Somebody may be trying to be very fierce that day. They may be trying to be very badass. And so, hello, you lovely, beautiful people. That sounds so flowery and wonderful. But that is not how they want to be perceived that day. And so when you think about that, it's important that we use very inclusive language. And so in yoga spaces, it seems to be a very female-dominated space, at least in the white Western cultural world. And so because of that, there's a lot of talk of, connecting with your womb, your divine feminine. Well, I think most people who have uteruses can understand that there are times when you don't want to connect with it. You do not want to have anything to do with it because it's just being a pain or it causes dysphoria. And so when we think about how we're connecting with energies, try to get away from the duality of gender, because gender is not a duality system. It's not binary. And so when we think about that, there are other energies we can connect with. We can connect with elemental energies. We can connect with lunar and solar energies. And yes, those traditionally have aspects that go along with gender, but also the sun and the moon have a lot of spiritual meaning around them that is completely, not a part of gender. We can connect with animal spirit type energies. We can connect with, our inner grizzly bear. We can connect with our inner playful, happy, puppy. We can connect with all sorts of different ways of thinking about the way that energy moves through our body without breaking it down into binary and gender and using language that isn't inclusive. And so I think that's important too, because even beyond the LGBTQIA plus community, even beyond all that, when you're dealing with people who are neurodivergent, when you're dealing with people who are of larger body, who have a chronic illness, there's a lot, there's gender dysphoria, of course, but there's also a lot of, grief and frustration and anger that goes along with the body that simply doesn't function the way that it ought to, or the way that you think about it. And so because of that, policing the language, and I shouldn't actually say policing, because again, that's another loaded word, but thinking about our language and being loving and inclusive with the language that we use really will help make our spaces inclusive. So these are just a few small things that I've thought about recently about how to make yoga more inclusive, things that I'm trying to do in my yoga. And so if you teach yoga, I would love to hear feedback from you about this, as far as how does this resonate with you? How do you try to make your classes more inclusive? And if you are a yoga student, if you take yoga classes, I'd like to hear from you too. And let's talk about what would make a yoga class inclusive for you. What would make you feel better coming to a yoga class? So thank you so much for listening to this show. I really appreciate it. And I encourage you to like, follow, share, all that good stuff on all the social media platforms. Until next time, please be kind to yourself. Thank you for listening to The Chicken Yogi Show, the podcast that brings you stories and wisdom from the chicken yogi, Kit Kilstow. The Chicken Yogi Show is presented on the Akiyam Radio Network and is supported by Chicken Yogi. Learn more about Kit's work at chickenyogi.com. Sign up for free Reiki and spiritual support, or schedule a paid session for more in-depth work. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow The Chicken Yogi on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as the podcast that you're listening to. Listen to all episodes and get show notes at chickenyogishow.com. Thank you for listening. Community, even beyond all that, when you're dealing with people who are neurodivergent, when you're dealing with people who are of larger body, who have a chronic illness, there's a lot. There's gender dysphoria, of course, but there's also a lot of, grief and frustration and anger that goes along with a body that simply doesn't function the way that it ought to, or the way that you think about it. And so because of that, policing the language, and I shouldn't actually say policing, because again, that's another loaded word, but thinking about our language and being loving and inclusive with the language that we use really will help make our spaces inclusive. So these are just a few small things that I've thought about recently about how to make yoga more inclusive, things that I'm trying to do in my yoga. And so if you teach yoga, I would love to hear feedback from you about this, as far as how does this resonate with you? How do you try to make your classes more inclusive? And if you are a yoga student, if you take yoga classes, I'd like to hear from you too. And let's talk about what would make a yoga class inclusive for you. What would make you feel better coming to a yoga class? So thank you so much for listening to this show. I really appreciate it. And I encourage you to like, follow, share, all that good stuff on all the social media platforms. Until next time, please be kind to yourself. Thank you for listening to The Chicken Yogi Show, the podcast that brings you stories and wisdom from the Chicken Yogi, Kit Kilstow. The Chicken Yogi Show is presented on the Akiam Radio Network and is supported by Chicken Yogi. Learn more about Kit's work at chickenyogi.com. Sign up for free Reiki and spiritual support, or schedule a paid session for more in-depth work. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow The Chicken Yogi on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as the podcast that you're listening to. Listen to all episodes and get show notes at chickenyogishow.com. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow The Chicken Yogi on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as the podcast that you're listening to. Listen to all episodes and get show notes at chickenyogishow.com. Thank you for listening.